I discovered my wife's affair by accident, but when I found out who the other man was, I realized something even worse: he had a perfect life. A wife, twin daughters, a career everyone admired, and in just 3 hours, everything he built collapsed. It started on an ordinary Tuesday night, the kind of quiet evening that usually fades from memory without leaving a trace. My wife had gone to take a shower, and I was sitting at the kitchen table with a half-finished cup of coffee growing cold beside me. The house was calm, almost too calm. The soft hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, and rain tapped gently against the windows. I had been trying to check an email for work, but my phone battery had died earlier in the evening. So I grabbed my wife's tablet from the living room coffee table, figuring it would only take a minute. At first, everything felt normal. Her home screen lit up, casting a pale glow across the dark kitchen. I opened the browser and began typing my email address. But before I could finish, a notification slid across the top of the screen. A message. The name attached to it meant nothing to me. But the preview stopped me cold. "I miss you already." My fingers hovered over the screen. For a moment, I told myself it could mean anything. A coworker. A friend. Someone being dramatic over something harmless. Still, something in my chest tightened. I shouldn't have opened it. Every part of me knew that. Trust is a fragile thing, and once you start looking for cracks, it's hard to stop. But curiosity has a quiet gravity to it. Before I could talk myself out of it, I tapped the notification. The conversation opened instantly. At first, my brain refused to process what I was reading. The messages were casual, playful, familiar in a way that felt deeply personal. The kind of tone people use when they've known each other for a long time. Then the words became clearer. Plans. Private jokes. Compliments that lingered just a little too long. And suddenly, the air in the kitchen felt heavier. My pulse began to thump in my ears as I scrolled further up the conversation. The thread stretched back weeks, maybe months. The deeper I went, the harder it became to ignore what was staring me in the face. This wasn't flirting. This was an affair. My hands rested on the table, the tablet glowing beneath my fingertips. I could hear the water running upstairs, the steady sound of the shower echoing faintly through the house. For a strange moment, everything felt suspended in time. Then I noticed something else. The man's profile picture. He looked older than me, early 40s maybe. Well-dressed. Confident. The kind of man who carried himself like he had everything figured out. I tapped the profile. More photos appeared. A large house. Backyard barbecues. Smiling family pictures. And then one photo that made my stomach drop. 2 young girls, identical down to their bright smiles, sitting on his shoulders. Twins. Standing beside them was a woman around his age, her arm wrapped gently around one of the girls. She had the calm presence of someone used to holding a family together. His wife. I leaned back slowly in the chair, staring at the screen. My wife wasn't just involved with another man. She was involved with someone who already had a life that looked perfect. Upstairs, the shower shut off. And suddenly, the quiet house felt like it was holding its breath. Expanse sleep never came that night. Even after I set the tablet back exactly where I had found it, my mind kept replaying the messages over and over again. Every sentence. Every emoji. Every small detail that now felt painfully obvious. My wife slept beside me like nothing had changed. Her breathing was slow and steady, the familiar rhythm that had once made me feel safe. But now, lying there in the darkness, it felt different. Distant. Like there was suddenly an invisible wall between us. By morning, I wasn't just hurt. I needed to understand. The moment she left for work, I sat down at my desk with a fresh cup of coffee and opened my laptop. The house was quiet again, but this time the silence felt sharper, filled with questions that refused to leave me alone. I searched the man's name. It didn't take long to find him. His online presence was polished, the kind you'd expect from someone successful. Professional profiles, conference photos, interviews in industry blogs. He had the confident smile of someone who had spent years building a reputation. Early 40s. Established career. Well respected in his field. The deeper I looked, the more his life unfolded across my screen. Pictures from charity events. Networking dinners. Vacation photos taken on beaches with bright blue water. The kind of life that looked effortless from the outside. But the photos that held my attention the longest weren't the professional ones. They were the family photos. There he was standing in a sunlit backyard, grilling burgers while two identical little girls ran across the grass with sparklers in their hands. Their laughter seemed almost visible in the picture. Twins. They looked about 7 or 8 years old. Another photo showed them sitting on the floor surrounded by birthday presents while he crouched beside them, smiling with the easy warmth of a proud father. And then there was her. His wife. She appeared in photo after photo, always close to the girls. Sometimes kneeling beside them, sometimes standing beside her husband with a calm, composed smile. She had the kind of presence that didn't demand attention but naturally held it anyway. Graceful. Confident. Someone who clearly believed in the life she had built. I found myself staring at one picture longer than the others. The four of them stood together on a beach at sunset. The twins were between their parents, their small hands wrapped around each adult's fingers. The sky behind them glowed with warm orange light, the kind photographers chase for hours. It looked like the definition of a perfect family. And yet, somewhere behind that picture, there were messages between my wife and her husband that told a completely different story. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my hand across my face. Anger was there, simmering just beneath the surface. But something else had started to creep in too. Curiosity. Because if my wife had been part of his life for months, maybe longer, then this woman in the photos had no idea what was happening behind her back. I clicked through more images, slowly piecing together the details of their life. School events. Family dinners. Weekend trips. Everything about it looked real. Stable. Happy. Which made the secret messages feel even heavier. For a long moment, I sat there staring at the screen, my coffee long forgotten. Then a quiet thought formed in the back of my mind. This woman deserved to know the truth. And once the idea settled in, it refused to leave. For 2 days, I tried to convince myself to let it go. It would have been easier that way. Pretend I never saw the messages. Pretend my life wasn't quietly cracking beneath the surface. But every time I looked at my wife, every time she spoke to me like nothing had changed, the same thought kept returning. There was another person living inside this lie. His wife. The woman from the photos. I had seen her face enough times by then that it felt strangely familiar, the calm confidence in her posture, the gentle way she stood beside her daughters. Someone who clearly believed the life around her was real. And maybe that's what made the decision for me. No one deserves to be the only person in the room who doesn't know the truth. So I found a way to contact her. Her professional profile listed an email for consulting inquiries. My message was simple and careful, written and rewritten at least 10 times before I finally pressed send. I told her I had information regarding a personal matter involving her husband and that it would be better discussed in person. Nothing dramatic. Nothing accusatory. Just the truth waiting quietly between the lines. She replied the next morning. Her message was polite but curious. She agreed to meet later that afternoon at a small cafe downtown. The hours leading up to that meeting stretched endlessly. My mind kept running through every possible outcome: anger, disbelief, accusations. Maybe she'd think I was lying. Maybe she'd walk away before I even finished explaining. Part of me almost hoped she would. But when the time came, I was already sitting at a corner table when the cafe door opened. The soft chime above the entrance echoed through the warm, coffee-scented room. And then she walked in. She looked exactly like the photos, maybe even more striking in person. Early 40s, tall, with an effortless grace in the way she carried herself. Her dark hair was pulled loosely back, and her expression held the calm focus of someone used to managing a busy life. For a moment she scanned the room. When our eyes met, she offered a polite smile and walked toward the table. "You must be the one who emailed me," she said gently as she sat down. Her voice was warm, steady. I suddenly realized my palms were sweating. "Yes," I said, forcing myself to return the smile. "Thank you for meeting me. I know it's a strange request." She folded her hands loosely on the table, studying my face with quiet curiosity. "You mentioned my husband in your message," she said. "Is everything all right?" The question landed heavier than she intended. For a second, I couldn't answer. The sounds of the cafe, the hiss of the espresso machine, quiet conversations from nearby tables, seemed to fade into the background. This was the moment where everything changed. I reached into my bag and slowly placed my phone on the table. "There's something you deserve to see," I said carefully. Her brow furrowed slightly as she leaned forward. I opened the screenshots of the messages and turned the screen toward her. At first, she only glanced at it casually. Then her eyes moved across the words. And I watched the exact moment her expression changed. The calm confidence in her face didn't disappear, but it cracked, just enough for the truth to slip through. Her fingers rested lightly on the edge of the table as she read. For several seconds, she didn't say a single word. And somehow, that silence felt louder than anything else in the room. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Her eyes moved slowly across the screen as she read through the messages. At first, her expression stayed almost perfectly controlled, like someone carefully holding their emotions in place. But the longer she looked, the harder that control became. Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the table. I suddenly became aware of every small sound in the cafe, the quiet clatter of dishes behind the counter, the low murmur of conversations at nearby tables, the steady hum of the espresso machine. Meanwhile, the world at our table had gone completely still. She kept scrolling. Each new message seemed to land heavier than the last. Finally, she stopped and set the phone down carefully, like it had somehow become fragile. "May I?" she asked softly, gesturing toward the phone. "Of course," I said. I slid it closer to her. Her hands were steady when she picked it up, but there was a faint tension in her fingers as she scrolled through the screenshots again, slower this time. Her eyes lingered on certain messages, as if trying to measure how long the secret had been living inside her life without her knowing. After a while, she exhaled quietly and placed the phone back on the table. For a few seconds she simply stared at the surface of the wood, her thoughts clearly somewhere far away. Then she finally spoke. "How long have you known?" "2 days," I said. She nodded faintly, absorbing that. "And you're certain these are recent?" "Yes." Another quiet pause followed. There was no shouting. No dramatic reaction. If anything, the calmness in her response made the moment feel heavier. She reached for the glass of water the waiter had placed on the table earlier, lifting it slowly. But halfway to her lips, her hand hesitated just slightly, a tiny tremor that almost went unnoticed. I instinctively reached forward and steadied the glass for her. Our fingers brushed for the briefest moment. It was such a small contact, barely more than a second, but in that moment it felt deeply human. Two strangers sitting across from each other, suddenly connected by the same painful truth. She took a sip of water and set the glass back down. "Thank you," she said quietly. Her voice was calm, but the softness in it carried something heavier beneath the surface. "I know this couldn't have been easy for you." I shook my head slowly. "It wasn't. But I figured you deserved to know." Her eyes lifted to meet mine. For the first time since she arrived, I saw something vulnerable flicker across her expression. Not weakness, more like the quiet shock of someone realizing the ground beneath them isn't as solid as they believed. "I appreciate that," she said. Outside the cafe window, Afternoon sunlight spilled across the street, warm and ordinary. People walked by laughing, carrying groceries, living their lives without any idea that two worlds had just shifted inside this small corner of the room. She leaned back slightly in her chair, taking a slow breath. "My daughters are at school right now," she said thoughtfully, almost to herself. "They'll be home in a few hours." The way she said it made it clear she was already thinking ahead, trying to understand what came next. Then her gaze returned to me. "Does your wife know that you know?" "Not yet." She nodded again, absorbing another piece of the puzzle. For a moment neither of us spoke. But something subtle had changed in the space between us. The tension of strangers had softened. What remained was something quieter, two people sitting across from each other, both realizing that their lives had just been pulled into the same storm. For several minutes after our conversation slowed, neither of us rushed to leave the cafe. It felt strange sitting there knowing that the quiet afternoon outside was about to collide with a truth that couldn't stay hidden anymore. She looked down at the phone again, her expression calmer now, not because the situation had become easier, but because she seemed to be shifting into a kind of quiet focus. The kind people find when they realize there's no avoiding what comes next. Finally, she looked up at me. "I think it's time we stop letting them control the story," she said. Her voice was steady, but there was a strength in it now that hadn't been there earlier. I nodded slowly. "Agreed." She reached into her purse and pulled out her own phone. For a moment she simply stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over her husband's name. Then she tapped it. The call rang once, twice, 3 times. When he answered, his voice sounded relaxed, unaware of the storm waiting on the other end. "Hey," he said casually. "Everything okay?" She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse him. "Can you come home?" she asked calmly. There was a pause. "Now?" "Yes." Her tone carried something quiet but undeniable, the kind of seriousness that leaves little room for questions. "All right," he said after a moment. "Is something wrong?" "We'll talk when you get here." She ended the call before he could say anything else. For a second she simply stared at the dark screen in her hand. Then she looked back at me. "I imagine you should probably talk to your wife too." I let out a slow breath. "Yeah." Neither of us smiled. But there was a strange sense of clarity settling in the space between us. The truth was finally moving forward. We stepped outside the cafe together. The afternoon air felt cooler now, the sky stretching wide above the street as people passed by without noticing the quiet tension between us. For a moment we stood on the sidewalk, unsure what to say next. Then she gently reached out and touched my arm. It was a simple gesture, but grounding. "Thank you for telling me," she said softly. I nodded. "I'm sorry it had to be this way." She held my gaze for a second longer before stepping back. "Good luck," she said. "You too." An hour later, I was standing in my own living room when my wife walked through the front door. She smiled when she saw me, setting her purse down like it was any normal day. But the moment she noticed the look on my face, the smile faded. "What's wrong?" she asked. I didn't shout. I didn't accuse. Instead, I simply placed my phone on the table and turned the screen toward her, the same screenshots I had shown earlier that afternoon. Her eyes moved across the messages. The color drained from her face almost instantly. And just like that, the lie that had been quietly growing in our lives collapsed in front of us. Across the city, another house was facing the same moment. Within 3 hours, 2 secrets had been exposed. 2 marriages were unraveling. And the perfect life everyone thought existed was gone. The weeks that followed felt strangely quiet. At first, everything moved fast. Lawyers, paperwork, long conversations that stretched late into the night. My wife and I eventually reached the point where there was nothing left to say. Once the truth had come out, the distance between us became impossible to ignore. But after the initial chaos settled, life slowed down again. The house felt different now, emptier, but also clearer somehow. Like a storm had passed through and carried away things that had already been broken long before I noticed. Still, there were moments when the silence felt heavier than I expected. One evening, about 3 weeks after everything happened, my phone buzzed while I was finishing dinner. Her name appeared on the screen. For a second I just stared at it. We hadn't spoken since that afternoon outside the cafe. I opened the message. "I hope you're doing okay. I was thinking, maybe we could talk sometime." The words were simple, but they carried a quiet understanding behind them. She knew exactly what the last few weeks had probably looked like for me. I typed back before I could overthink it. "I'd like that." We agreed to meet the following evening. This time it wasn't a cafe. Instead, we chose a small park near the river, a place that felt open and calm, far away from the tension that had surrounded our first meeting. The sun was just beginning to set when I arrived. Golden light stretched across the water, and a soft breeze moved through the trees lining the walking path. People passed by slowly, couples walking dogs, joggers with headphones, parents pushing strollers. Normal life continuing, just like always. I spotted her sitting on a wooden bench near the path. When she stood to greet me, she looked different than she had that day in the cafe. Not weaker, but lighter somehow. Like the weight of uncertainty had finally been replaced with clarity. "Hey," she said softly. "Hey." For a moment we both laughed a little awkwardly, realizing how strange this situation really was. Two people who had met through betrayal, now choosing to meet again. We started walking along the river path, the conversation slowly finding its rhythm. She told me how the confrontation had gone. Her husband admitted everything eventually. There had been anger, tears, long nights of painful honesty. But in the end, she made the decision to leave. "My daughters are adjusting," she said gently. "Kids are stronger than we give them credit for." I nodded. "My wife and I separated too." She glanced at me with quiet sympathy. "That must have been hard." "It was," I admitted. "But I think it was already over long before I discovered the messages." For a moment we walked in silence, listening to the soft sound of water moving against the riverbank. Then she let out a small breath and shook her head. "You know what the strangest part is," she said. "What?" She smiled faintly. "I haven't laughed much these past few weeks, but talking to you actually makes things feel normal again." Something about the way she said it made me smile too. As we continued walking, she reached out absent-mindedly and looped her arm lightly through mine. It was such a natural gesture that neither of us mentioned it. But in that quiet moment, beneath the fading sunset, walking beside someone who understood exactly what the last few weeks had been like, the world didn't feel quite as heavy anymore. A few months can change a person in ways that are hard to notice at first. Looking back, the chaos of those first weeks felt distant now, like a storm that had once been loud and violent, but eventually drifted away, leaving the sky strangely clear. Life had settled into something new. Not the life I thought I would have a year earlier. Not the one I had built with my wife. But something quieter, and, in a way, more honest. During those months, she and I continued meeting occasionally. Sometimes for coffee. Sometimes for long walks along the same river path where we had met that evening after everything fell apart. It was never rushed. Neither of us tried to define what was happening between us. After everything we had both been through, we understood the value of letting things unfold slowly. One evening near the start of autumn, we met again at the park. The air had grown cooler, carrying the crisp scent of fallen leaves. The sun was dipping low behind the trees, painting the sky with soft shades of orange and gold. She was already sitting on the same wooden bench by the water when I arrived. When she saw me walking toward her, her face warmed with a quiet smile. "Hey," she said as I sat down beside her. "Hey." For a few minutes we simply watched the river together. The water moved steadily, reflecting the fading light of the sky. Somewhere across the park, children were laughing while a dog barked excitedly in the distance. It was peaceful. Comfortable. After a moment, she leaned back slightly on the bench and let out a thoughtful breath. You know, she said, if someone had told me 6 months ago that my life would look like this, I would have thought they were crazy. I chuckled softly. Same here. She turned her head slightly to look at me. For a while, I thought everything I built had been wasted, she admitted quietly. The marriage, the plans, all the years invested in someone who clearly didn't value them the same way. Her voice wasn't bitter. Just honest. But now, she continued, glancing back toward the river, I think maybe it was just a chapter ending. I nodded slowly. That's a good way to see it. For a moment we sat in silence again. Then she shifted slightly closer on the bench. Our shoulders touched lightly, a small contact that felt natural now after months of slowly growing familiarity. I'm glad we met, she said. The words were simple, but there was warmth in them. Even if the circumstances were terrible. I smiled faintly. Yeah, me too. The sky above the river was fading into twilight now, the color slowly softening as the sun disappeared behind the horizon. After a moment, she gently rested her hand over mine on the bench. Her fingers were warm. Neither of us pulled away. There was no dramatic confession. No rushed promises about the future. Just two people sitting quietly beside each other, both aware of the fragile beginning forming between them. Finally, she squeezed my hand lightly. So, she said with a small smile, what happens next? I looked out at the calm river ahead of us. And for the first time in a long while, the future didn't feel like something to fear. We figure it out, I said. Together. And somehow, that felt like enough.